Okay. So yes, hey, welcome everybody to panel on abolition of suffering, towards the abolition of suffering through science. And that was David's suggested title. So thanks, David. Now I think there's been some. Hi, Brian. I think there's been some confusion now about what the abolition of suffering means and what it refers to. David, would you like to just give us a brief introduction of what the abolition of suffering is in your words?
Well, in some sense, suffering is a primitive term that someone who has congenital analgesia and is abnormally hypothymic, I'm not sure one could convey what suffering was like to them. But intuitively, most of us know what suffering is, ranging from physical pain, if one catches one's hand in the door, to all the different forms of psychological pain. And though in one sense psychological pain is tremendously diverse, thanks to our rich syntax, one can be unhappy and suffer for millions or billions of different things. We have a number of core emotions, and yes, as far as I can see, the idea is that science will ultimately enable us to phase out the biology of suffering, not just in humans and ultimately non-human animals. I can go into more detail if you like, but perhaps I'll just throw things open to the other participants.
Yeah, definitely. Who wants to go next?
Yeah. So, I mean, not too much to add to that, but it does seem like I think everyone here could agree that some things feel better than others. And I guess we could define suffering as things that feel especially bad compared to other things. And there might be some kind of crisp theoretical cutoff of, this is suffering and this isn't, or just somewhat arbitrary, but by all means, just particularly unpleasant experiences.
Yes.
What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would add that as a simple heuristic that I tend to use for defining what a suffering is, and more generally, like what negative experience is, and it's a heuristic. It's not a formal definition. It's essentially ask yourself, would I rather be asleep right now or awake? And if the answer is if you'd rather be asleep, it's sort of you would rather not exist. It's your experience right now is worth less than nothing, and that's kind of like a natural cutoff between like what's positive and negative. Just a heuristic.
Yeah, I like that.
Brian?
I agree with a lot of what's been said. One thing I would add is that, like, I take the view that Mike said in his second part of the answer, that suffering may be more arbitrary and more fuzzy to define. But at the same time, I think many people share the intuition that suffering is particularly urgent from a moral perspective. And at least in my life and in the lives of many people, suffering has a particular character that makes us feel that we should prevent it with a high priority. So different people can care about different things to different degrees, but when you experience really intense suffering, there's something about it that makes you just want to prevent it from happening, like in yourself and in other people. And that impulse motivates me, and it probably motivates many other people.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
I think we've given. Sorry, Tom, did you want to add to that? Sorry, I heard you just speak. Anyway, so I think we've got given enough time to join. Now, we might as well start introducing people. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Adam. I'm going to be hosting this online discussion here. I will be sort of fielding questions but not answering them myself. So I host an online sort of video channel called The Rational Future, and the Science Technology in the Future is the website that I'm using at the moment. And there's plenty of videos up there, including ones about suffering and lot of interviews with David Pearce, a lot of interviews with David Pearce. So we'll move over to first David, if you want to quickly introduce yourself. Quite a bit of echo happening. I'm sorry about that. So David, do you want to introduce yourself? I'll give you a quick introduction. David's co-founded the World Transhumanism
Yes.
many years ago.
Apologies for the sound quality, but I hope you can getting echo. Okay. Yeah. Basically, I'm a transhumanist. Many years ago, back in 1998, when the web was young, I set up with Nick Bostrom Transhumanist Association, now Humanity Plus. What is transhumanism? Essentially, transhumanism to overcome most, if not all, humans would want us to aim for some kind of triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity. What is going to be our focus here tonight? Getting rid of suffering, perhaps, and this is more speculative, a future of radical super happiness, but much more modestly phasing out the biology of involuntary suffering. And though in one sense, one can distinguish to some extent it's a watershed hedonic zero, which isn't arbitrary, but in principle it seems as though it is going to be possible to phase out experience growth hedonic zero in our forward light curve. And this is what I think we should be aiming for as transhumanists and as effective activists.
Excellent, David. Okay, so Andres, do you want to introduce yourself? And David, I'm wondering, while he's introducing himself, can you get some earphones or something? Because we're getting quite a bit of feedback. Some echo. Okay, Andres.
David.
Can you turn off your volume?
Hello? Hello? Yes, I think there's still feedback. David, maybe you can get earphones, or reduce the volume of the computer.
Am I being instructed to do something?
Can you reduce the volume of your computer?
David, all you need to do, have you got any earphones? So if you put in some earphones, like plug it into your because we're getting some pretty serious echoes, and I can see that you're the only one without earphones. So, or you can just try and mute your microphone. But the long-term solution is for you to wear earphones.
Can you turn off the volume at the very least? I suspect that may cancel quite a bit of the feedback.
Okay, cool.
There you go.
Yeah, Andres, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yes, sure. So I just graduated from Stanford. I'm still getting echoes, so I'm not sure what the source is. So the question is, like, how much can people understand if the echo continues?
I'll try mine too.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's still echo. It's pretty annoying. Not sure what the source could possibly be. It seems like it might actually be intrinsic to the call. Yeah. So yeah, I'll just explain a little bit, which is
Echo is gone now.
Oh yeah, it's gone now. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so
muting mic fixed it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I just graduated from Stanford with a master's in psychology with a focus in computational psychology. And essentially my deepest interest is consciousness, which is like ultimately the, as I understand it, the source of goodness and badness. Anything that could possibly matter ultimately matters because somebody is conscious of positive or negative experiences. And my particular focus is trying to understand the computational properties of consciousness. And I can just like very briefly explain what I mean by this. So essentially the main idea is that consciousness must be doing something, or otherwise evolution wouldn't have recruited for it. And the sort of like a very reasonable hypothesis is that the thing that consciousness is doing, that is doing better than other alternatives that evolution could have chosen, is information processing. And so there must be some comparative advantage for consciousness in information processing. And the particular comparative advantage I'm looking into, and thanks to the suggestion of David Pearce, is a phenomenal binding. Essentially the idea that you're experiencing multiple pieces of information at once. And that is like the thing that makes consciousness special and particularly useful for doing particular computational tasks. And why does this matter for reducing suffering? Well, essentially, suffering was recruited by natural selection because it has some functional properties that play a role in the inclusive fitness of biological organisms. So if we figure out what exactly the computational properties of consciousness are, and also what the functional role of suffering is, we may be able to essentially substitute the nastiness of suffering by something that is equally functional, but doesn't actually feel bad. And in my particular end of the project in this domain is really like reverse engineering the computational properties of consciousness. Is basic science, essentially. All right.
Shall we continue with introductions? I have responses to what you said, but maybe we should all introduce first.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. I was just muted there for a second. I forgot. So, yeah, thank you, Andreas. So, Brian, would you like to continue with the introductions?
Sure. So, I'm interested in this topic since, well, I guess in 2000, I was inspired to get interested in altruism and making the world a better place when I attended a speech by Ralph Nader. And until 2005, I was mostly focused on politics. But in 2005, I learned about utilitarianism and started reading Peter Singer, and was introduced to a more philosophical end of things. So since then, I've kind of been interested in what's now called effective altruism and how to, in practice, achieve good outcomes. And at first, I was what you would call a classical utilitarian. I thought happiness was important and suffering was important. But over time, I became more of a negative utilitarian, thinking that at least extreme suffering was particularly morally urgent, and that certain experiences might not be comparable to pleasure in their moral value. So since then, I've been exploring reducing suffering in a number of domains, such as factory farms, wild animal suffering, the potential for digital suffering, especially in the far future on a galactic scale, and in other domains as well. So I studied computer science, math in college, but I also am very interested in philosophy and basically all other subjects. I'll leave it at that.
Cool. So my name is Mike Johnson, and I live in the Bay, and I guess I'm most interested in. Oh, perfect. No echo. Great. I'm most interested in just understanding what suffering is. The first step to doing anything, if you want to maximize one quantity and minimize another, is to understand what we're maximizing and what we're minimizing. So I tend to think of suffering as a certain sort of pattern in a conscious system. It's just a matter of trying to quantify mathematically what this pattern is. And I do think it has a crisp answer. I think not all of us agree on every metaphysical point here. I'm hoping we can kind of come to some common ground as far as some things about like how to figure out what suffering is. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. Oh, Adam, you're currently muted. So if you want to.
Thank you. Okay. All right. No worries. Okay. Well, just by way of like, oh no, it's just by way of like feedback. Anyway, so I think there's a lot of people here who've been doing research into what is valence and what contributes to suffering. I'd be interested to hear about that research. Now, I know that like Andreas has been doing some research recently. Would you like to talk about your project?
Oh yeah, undoubtedly. So I have quite a few projects going on in qualiacomputing.com, but essentially you can divide them into two broad categories. So the first one is like defining state spaces for things that matter. Essentially, what is the range of possibilities or degrees of freedom in a particular domain that might have like ethical relevance. So I did, for example, a project called the state space of drug effects, where essentially I asked people from all over the place who had taken various kinds of substances and altered their consciousness, and asked them to essentially fill out this questionnaire with like quite a few questions relating to the properties of the subjective quality of the experience catalyzed by a particular substance. And then I conducted a statistical technique on it called factor analysis, which essentially extracts the major axes of variance, so the way in which the substances are different to each other. And ethically, the ethical relevance of this was that I was able to extract essentially 3 axes of euphoria, that is like well-being, subjective well-being. It turns out, I'll just add this detail to illustrate. There's like essentially 3 varieties of euphoria that can be catalyzed by substances. The first one is like fast euphoria, like amphetamines and stimulants. The second is slow euphoria, like opioids and alcohol. And the third is philosophical or spiritual euphoria, depending how you want to call it, but essentially it is a deeper kind of experience that it's also associated with a profound loving kindness that gets beyond the other 2 kind of pleasures. But that's one part of my project, like state spaces. I'm currently doing a research on the state space of beliefs about consciousness because I think that's very relevant. But the other part of the project is essentially developing good psychophysical measures for figuring out the computational properties of visual experience in particular. I could be doing it for like auditory experience or tactile experience, but the more studyable information processing, as far as I'm concerned, is visual experience. There's a lot of work in there. So I'm essentially programming a bunch of psychophysical tasks so that when psychedelic research becomes more widely culturally accepted, there will be a large baggage of pre-made tools that we can start to use right away and like contribute to the research right away rather than waiting for people to develop them. I'm very much of a sort of go and do it kind of person. So like if there's like interesting and ethically relevant research opportunities, I try to just go ahead and do them without anybody's permission.
Right, unmuted. Yeah, like either David or Brian, do you want to go next and talk about your research? David?
Sure, I can.
Oh, it's Brian?
I think I'll go.
I think David's still muted.
Yeah. So, in the last, well, I guess since 2005, actually, in 2006, David Pearce gave me a website. He told me that I should put my writings online, and so I did, and it was called utilitarianessays.com, and I've since renamed it to reducingsuffering.org when I migrated to a different platform. But basically, that's the collection of various thoughts I have on a bunch of topics. And so I've done research on things like wild animal suffering, whether insects can suffer, and if so, what are the implications, thoughts about consciousness in general, thoughts on artificial general intelligence and its implications for the future, thoughts on cooperation and arms races, especially with HEI development, and a lot of things like that. In 2013, some friends and I established a group called the Foundational Research Institute, which has the goal of promoting this kind of exploration in a broader context. So I've written many things, but we want to bring in more people who can contribute the same kinds of new ideas. And so currently that's underway. We've got a new research assistant or research fellow as of a few months ago. He's working on suffering-focused ethics and other scenarios related to improving cooperation in the future and things like that. And so those are some of the outlines, and I'm sure we'll get into the details of many of those topics as we go forward.
Excellent. David, do you want to follow up there? You're still muted, by the way. David, you're muted. No, I can't unmute David because he's muted himself. My unmute button is grayed out for David. Okay.
There you go.
Yes, good one.
Can you hear?
Yes, got you. Certainly can.
Testing?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, first of all, non-human animals. Probably the greatest source of severe and readily avoidable suffering in the world today is factory farming. And yeah, in a sense, before doing anything else, the obvious thing to do is to get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut and outlawed. And like Brian, I have been interested in the issue of wild animal suffering, free-living animal suffering, but yes, before even thinking of the suffering of non-human animals in the wild, it makes sense to stop doing the frightful things we're doing to non-human animals in factory farms. In the case of human beings, what can we do to improve long-term quality of life? My particular focus has been on the hedonic treadmill, the set of negative feedback mechanisms that ensure most people are neither exceptionally happy or exceptionally unhappy for very long. I mean, these relatively well-known studies now suggesting that perhaps 6 months after a lottery win or becoming quadriplegic, most people will have reverted to the level of well-being or ill-being they experienced before the accident. That's perhaps oversimplified, but crudely seems to be the case. And In recent years, decoding the human genome, we are starting to tease out particular genes and the allelic combinations associated with high and low hedonic set points. And if we're serious about reducing and ultimately phasing out suffering in humans, I think we're going to have to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, starting off with pre-implantation genetic screening being offered freely, together with counselling to all prospective parents. More people are becoming familiar with the idea that it's possible to screen for terrible diseases like Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis, but insofar as we accept that low mood and depression is associated with an extremely poor quality of life, at least as poor as something like cystic fibrosis, then I think all parents should be encouraged to use pre-implantation genetic screening. There's two other reasons for focusing on recalibrating the hedonic treadmill rather than maximizing bliss. First reason is simple functionality, that if we, insofar as we are to retain high functioning well-being, critical insight, social responsibility, intellectual progress, to preserve patients, whether you're temperamentally extremely happy or depressive, it's critical informational sensitivity is retained. There's a second reason too, in that many people are not utilitarians of any description. Many people are religious. Many people will not share our particular beliefs and value systems. Advantages of aiming for hedonic recalibration is that it doesn't involve imposing our conception of the good life or the ideal society on others. I mean, even if your typical hedonic set point, your normal hedonic tone, were orders of magnitude richer than it is today, I mean, you could still support your favourite football team, to use a relatively trivial example, retain existing preference architecture.
I think David might have cut off.
Yeah, maybe
No.
David. Yep, that's all right.
We could go to Mike and me.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if David's finished.
Yeah, sorry, I can talk more.
I know. Yeah. I just didn't realize because it seemed like your video cut off for a second there. That's all. But you might have actually concluded. I'm not sure. So yeah. So all right. Well, it seems as though David's finished. That was great, David. Mike, do you want to give us an introduction? Oh, sorry. Do you want to give us an introduction about your projects and what you're doing in research? What you're doing again.
Right. So I'm kind of aiming for a. So I'm working with a neuroscientist in the Bay Area, Dr. Randall Cohen, and we're approaching valence, or so I use the term valence as kind of a term with less baggage than pain or pleasure or suffering. That we're aiming for an information theoretic definition of valence, and a lot of people think that it's silly to try to construct one because it's somehow kind of an intrinsically relative or subjective, or I don't know. There seems to be a lot of confusion over this, and I think the best way to break out of that confusion is simply to start making hypotheses and testing them. I mean, if we were in 1800, I would imagine that many people would think that electromagnetism was a very mysterious force, that it kind of made sense, but not always, and we could kind of make it do what we wanted, but it, many people would have argued that it was intrinsically irreducible. But fast forward to Maxwell, and it turns out that it's actually a pretty quantifiable property of the universe, that we can speak about it with a very high degree of precision. And I think valence is the same way. So we're focused on a couple things. One is sort of attempting to so if valence is a pattern within a data set, then first of all, what's a good approach to defining the data set, to defining what we're talking about in terms of a conscious system? And then second of all, the question is, what's a good heuristic for trying to reverse engineer exactly what pattern it is within that data set? And the to be brief here, we're aiming for something very crisp and hopefully something concise enough to fit on a t-shirt.
Nice. So it's interesting. It seems as though there seems to be quite a lot more people interested in doing direct research on valence. Why is it such an exciting time right now to be interested to do research on valence and aspects of consciousness related to suffering and bliss? What is it about this time that's perhaps a little bit different from like 10 to 15 years ago, or maybe even longer than that? Why is it a great time now to be interested in these sorts of things as an avenue of research?
Yeah, can I answer that one? or were you asking it to anybody?
No, this is a general question for everybody here in the room.
Okay, yes. I have some thoughts on that. So I think right now we're actually in some critical period in terms of mimetic sort of like phase change in humanity. People may complain about the effect of Facebook in society. I don't think anybody actually has any idea what the actual cultural impact of like social networks and the internet is. But things such as less wrong, or like the hedonistic imperative, and various other much more systematized and coherent ideologies than the ones we've had in the past are becoming much more prevalent. People are able to shop around between various views and ideologies and get access to community really fast. Like 5 years ago, I was completely lost. I thought I was alone in the universe thinking about these things, and now, like, actually, there's like a huge cluster I'm a part of, and it's growing very fast. We make it diminishing returns. We say like transhumanist slash consciousness hacking slash utilitarian community, or like the whole cluster there. And nonetheless, it is pretty much the point where if a bad meme gets to be too popular, we might be screwed, or might be irreversible. It's sort of, if there's a time where we should be pushing for like focusing in valence rather than other less important matters, is I think now. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I think you might have cut off for the very last, to the end of the last sentence.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I said that if there is a time to do it, it is now, because we're like mimetic phase transition.
Yeah, Mike or Brian? I know Mike's had something to say about this because I read his blog. So, Mike, would you like to jump in here?
I think Andres nailed it. We absolutely are in kind of a very kind of delicate position as far as people are looking for what to value. The thing about the singularity talk about technological progress and singularity, it doesn't tell us what to value. And I think, I mean, we could go a lot worse than saying pleasure is good and pain is bad, of course. And I also think that, I mean, it's kind of like a startup, that we're trying to do this thing that maybe is only possible now, but people haven't realized it's possible yet. And that's the best time to get in and produce value, create value, and to really try and guide this into a good direction. Adam, did you have anything else in mind?
Well, yeah, I mean,
I know we've spoken about this.
What technologies do we have right now that enables valence research that we didn't really have? So what data do we have now that wasn't available like 15 years ago commonly? Has the quality of the data became just like a lot better as well? Andreas, you were about to say something?
I was about to say, so I mean, obviously you have like all of the, Mike, can you mute? Yes, we obviously have like all of the neurological technologies that are like picking up speed. I mean, we have like obviously fMRI, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, nootropics, all sorts of research chemicals coming out all the time with interesting properties. Soon we will, I think, like find a suitable combination of chemicals and techniques that will produce the ultimate experience of pure bliss. And some observers may even say that we have already found such a thing. It's called combining 5-MeO-DMT with MDMA. Apparently produces the most intense euphoria of everything that anybody has tried. And it's a wonderful candidate for something to study academically as soon as possible for like urgently ethical reasons. But there's also the possibility of like the interconnectedness of the internet. Just like to explain what I mean by this. I worked at a company a few years ago where we were looking at essentially these like big dataset of people saying how they feel in these things called mood updates, essentially many times a day explaining how they feel and why they feel that way. And I conducted quite a bit of research on that dataset, essentially creating models of affective transitions. Essentially the kind of model I created is such that if you give me a list of the previous emotions that you have experienced in the last month or so, I can give you a probability cloud of the emotions that you will experience in the future that is much better than something like a psychologist or even a good friend may be able to predict about you. It's just like highly data-driven approaches. And I think, yeah, we're like essentially getting to the point where these research will become commonplace. It's something that couldn't have happened even 5 or 10 years ago.
Brian, do you have anything to say on the matter?
Well, I'm not sure I totally agree with the question in the sense that I don't know that this is a particularly special time, although I do agree with what Andres and others and Mike have said about there are different technologies now. I also have some skepticism about this particular approach being the best thing to focus on now. We'll probably debate that a bit later. I tend to think that improving the trajectory of the future and making society more ready for new technologies is more important than advancing the state of the art in technology or research. Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about that more.
Looks as though we've just lost David temporarily. So, let's see. Okay, well, Mike or Brian, depends on who wants to talk right now. Do you want to go into more detail about what you're researching? Like, for instance, Brian, you were actually, let's just talk about like some of the big picture ideas. So, you're talking about like a space colonization as a possibility of increasing suffering if we sort of continue the same sort of ways that we conduct, you know, if we like farm animals in space or produce lots of life in space that isn't calibrated to sort of necessarily not feel as much suffering and feel more sort of more of a hedonic sort of experience. So do you want to talk about space colonization and what we should do to make sure it doesn't actually increase suffering?
Yeah. So the reason why it's concerning that space colonization might increase suffering is the simplest version is just to say that when you colonize space, you spread computation and sentience to other planets. That's the purpose of space colonization for the most part. And so when you multiply the amount of sentience by orders of magnitude, you multiply the amount of suffering by orders of magnitude unless you drastically change the quality of that sentience. I mean, there's hope that humanity can become more humane by the time it colonizes. But given the current state of things, like given that we still have factory farms in 2015 and that most people don't care about animals at all for the most part, except maybe some pets or other close companions, it's not obvious that humanity will get to a point where we can trust that it will make good decisions or be compassionate when it colonizes. So I wouldn't worry about factory farms. Spreading factory farms probably, like I assume that meat will be obsolete within 100 years or so. Moreover, I think colonization will probably be done by artificial intelligence, which doesn't eat organic matter, it eats sunlight or something. So, like, I don't think factory farming is the big issue, but there are concerns about other forms of suffering, such as if biological life does do the colonizing, then we should worry about spreading wild animal suffering to other planets. The most conservative scenario would be if we terraform Mars in the coming millennia, we would, by the process of terraforming, create a habitable atmosphere, spread plant life, and then eventually have animal life as well to make Mars habitable and maybe eventually grow crops and things like that. So there's debate about whether terraforming is possible, but it's certainly something that serious scientists talk about. And if it did happen, that would multiply the amount of wild animal suffering in our neighborhood. Then even worse would be what's called directed panspermia, where you spread genetic material, maybe microbes or some other thing that could take root on habitable planets. And so the idea is, rather than picking a particular planet to terraform, you spread genetic material throughout the universe and hope that some of it lands on some planet in some Goldilocks zone that has the right atmosphere and the right temperature and water, and hope that it can eventually take root and form life there. So that's another way in which we might spread biological life beyond its realm honor. And then I think it's maybe more likely that digital intelligence will control the future within the next centuries. And in that case, rather than spreading biological life, the digital intelligence would probably spread digital life in various forms. So for the most part, digital intelligence will look more abstract. It would probably look a lot like, I mean, a lot of the computations being done by a digital artificial general intelligence colonization wave, at least at the beginning, would probably be very instrumental computations, maybe similar to what we see on the internet, or like business kind of computations, not so much animals. But in the long run, I would expect many artificial general intelligence controlled civilizations to produce simulations and creatures that we would regard as more animal-like. One reason would be if the AGI wants to study biology or wants to study whether there are going to be extraterrestrials in its Hubble volume, then it's going to want to run simulations of the origin of life, or like learn about ecosystems, and it may run lots of wild animal simulations as part of that. If humans colonize, there may be humans who value nature and they regret losing nature on Earth, so they want to simulate lots of virtual reality nature simulations, and to enhance the accuracy of the simulation, they include sentient wild animals. We can hope that most humans would be relatively compassionate with the simulations that they create, but that's far from guaranteed, especially when you look at what the contents of video games are today. So those are many ways in which suffering might be expanded by colonization. And so there I focused on the animal-like forms of sentience, but there are also possibilities that the instrumental computations of an intelligent civilization might themselves suffer in certain cases to certain degrees. So I call this suffering subroutines, the idea that certain learning algorithms, or even just information broadcasting or other routine operations of information processing could contain suffering, or could be seen as at least rudimentary forms of suffering. And in that case, many of the operations of any artificial intelligence, whether human-controlled or so-called paperclip maximizing, could contain lots of low-level suffering through these suffering subroutines. So basically, when you spread computation, in my view, you spread sentience. Intelligent computation has a higher degree of sentience than dead life, or dead planets. So multiplying the amount of computation almost certainly implies multiplying the amount of suffering. And especially when you talk about suffering subroutines, it's very hard to it would be very hard to completely eliminate that kind of suffering, because a lot of it's built into just the nature of information processing. And I'm sure we'll debate this with the others later, but I take the view that you can't completely eliminate suffering and get the same task performance, because I think a lot of what suffering is intrinsic to avoiding or marshaling resources to prevent something. And to some extent, I think that's going to be fundamentally a kind of suffering, even though I do agree that we can mitigate how bad it is. And so as far as what to do about space colonization, I think one implication is that we should focus on improving the humaneness and putting the future on a good trajectory, rather than focusing on making sure that humanity colonizes space. There's a big push among some effective altruists and others to set up a colony on Mars, or create disaster recovery systems or something to make sure that space does get colonized. But I think the bigger priority should be to make sure that if we do colonize space, which I think is very likely unless civilization declines, then that we should make that process more humane and build in concern for suffering in a similar way as we have concerns for, say, lab animals or animal welfare standards on farms. The same sorts of things will need to be applied to simulations and instrumental computations of the future. So yeah, the main thing I would push for would be to create a bigger movement of people who are concerned about these issues, who think reducing suffering is very important, and therefore who are going to explore the best ways to make sure humanity goes in a more humane direction.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brian. You brought up some really interesting points. So one of them, I guess the main point there was that, what are we doing about the future of Valence? And you brought up the point that you believe that Valence is tied up with complexity in computation. I think we should return to that topic, but before we do, I want to give David the opportunity to talk about what it is right now, whether it is actually a unique or an opportune time to do this, to do research on valence and to do research in the area of mitigating suffering and maximizing bliss.
Yes, if at all possible, one wants to avoid going off into long metaphysical, philosophical discussions that sometimes seem as though they lead nowhere. And yet at the same time, unless we do, in a sense, understand the nature of the universe and reality and the basis of mind and consciousness, how else can we even hope to act ethically and understand the ultimate sphere of our responsibilities? And here I think unavoidably we come to a difference of view between my perspective and, for example, someone like Brian. Most of my work certainly has assumed that only biological organisms suffer, and perhaps in theory futuristic quantum computers. And once we have phased out the biology of suffering here on Earth, then if, and it's still a big if, then suffering sentience does not exist elsewhere within our cosmological horizon, then in one sense our ethical duties will have been discharged so long as we make sure it doesn't occur again. However, this depends on a number of quite controversial assumptions about the nature of sentience and binding, and if the perspective that I would defend is mistaken, and Brian is correct, and the very scope of the abolitionist project is radically different. Brian, as we know, is perhaps most famous for his idea that even today video game characters can suffer, not in the full-blown sense, but at least minimal suffering, and that in future there may be digital hell worlds, whereas on technical reasons, I don't think classical digital computers can solve the phenomenal binding problem, and they will always be zombies.
Right, okay, so that's interesting. So why is phenomenal binding important here? What comparative advantage did phenomenal binding have, do you think, in an evolutionary environment? And why, why isn't it important to understand the underpinning like physical phenomena of valence, whether it's an emergent property of computation, whether it's actually something fundamental, more fundamental, in physics, in order to create an accurate picture or a better picture about where to go in the future with this sort of research?
Yes, well, if orthodox neuroscientific understanding of the brain and nerve cells is correct, then even if it is the case that individual neurons, as microelectrode studies suggest, can support rudimentary experiences, whether painful or pleasurable or squeaks or tickles or any of the kinds of experience that electrode studies suggest. Nonetheless, if they weren't somehow bound into unitary percepts, then we would be so-called micro-experiential zombies, simply patterns of Jamesian mind dust. And so in that sense, it wouldn't really matter what a micro-experiential zombie undergoes. So yes, in that sense, I think the issue is really important, understanding the nature of binding. By analogy, one can think of the population of the USA, skull-bound minds. It's a question I perhaps ask people: do you believe if the population of the USA, 320 billion skull-bound minds, if they were intercommunicating, agreed to participate in an experiment, were to execute any computation you like, do you believe that at some stage a unitary subjective experience, pancontinental subjective experience would switch on with pleasures, pain, jealousy, a migraine, music, or regardless of how they were functionally interconnected, would one still have, in a sense, a micro-experiential zombie? And the mystery is, how is it that discrete, decoherent, membrane-bound, supposedly classical neurons intercommunicating via synapses, how is it that at least when we're awake or dreaming can sustain either local binding of individual objects and global binding? Now one can show how it is tremendously fitness enhancing to be able to support binding. Probably the best way to understand the phenomenon is look at syndromes where binding at least partially breaks down, such as simultanagnosia, where someone can only apprehend a single visual object at once, or motion blindness, where they can't actually, let's say, see the predator moving towards them. The predator is over there, then a bit nearer, then right almost on top of them. Tremendously advantageous to be able to run real-time dynamic simulations, cross-modally matched, of objects, that are locally bound and globally bound. By global binding, if one perhaps thinks of someone with extreme forms of schizophrenia and no unitary self. But it's not enough simply to suggest that a phenomenon is fitness enhancing or adaptive. After all, telepathy would be, precognition would be extremely adaptive. What one needs to do is to come up with some mechanistic account of how this is feasible. Now, as I said, I belong to, tentatively at any rate, I go down the quantum mind route and neuronal superpositions. But this is extremely speculative, it needs to be tested, and of course it's quite possible that this account of mind is mistaken.
Yes, gonna interject quickly. Yeah, also Brian definitely had it right. It's when either, both Adam and Mike are unmuted, that's when the echo happens. To sort of like condense, I think, like the essential sort of disagreement about consciousness between Brian and David, I would say the following. So essentially, in Brian's account, suffering and pain itself is the instantiation of negative reinforcement algorithms. Like, as long as you have that sort of information processing, that is suffering. Whereas a view such as David's or mine, what we think is that rather, actually, you have pain and suffering existing as possible experiences to begin with, and that evolution recruited those states of consciousness to instantiate an algorithm. In other words, they are components of an algorithm, building blocks of an algorithm. And to sort of like explain a little bit further as an intuition, you can essentially have functionally irrelevant pain. You can essentially take some opioid antagonist or like stimulate your brain in a certain way and have pain without necessarily having any of the behavioral or cognitive properties associated with it. Or likewise, you can, as I was mentioning, take 5-MeO DMT and MDMA and essentially be motionless with very little cortical activity, and yet to be in a profound state of bliss, where you can argue that it's not really the result of information processing, but rather the view is that evolution sort of diluted various forms of consciousness and used them as building blocks of information processing algorithms. And yes, like I think this is tremendously important. I don't 100% believe this is the case, and I think the work of Brian is absolutely fantastic and really ethically important, because if it turns out, for example, that phenomenal binding is not what David and I think, then indeed video game characters may be in some respect capable of suffering, and that would be terrible, terrible news. But as they say, we shouldn't just discard a view because it sounds horrible. Unfortunately, we just need to accommodate to what's true. And if Brian is correct, then my focus will be very different indeed.
Yeah, very well said. So I tend to take an information theoretic view, which follows Brian, that I don't think there's anything sort of metaphysically privileged as far as what kind of brains we have, that I think one could, in theory, build a computer that could suffer or feel great too. And initial assumptions do sort of lead one to very different conclusions. So I mean, I'm more about patterns rather than kind of more abstract patterns, not functional patterns. Like, for example, like I think the work that Brian does is awesome, and it's actually one of the things that got me personally interested in this topic. That reading his essays has been wonderful. I think an interesting data point against the reinforcement learning hypothesis is Kent Berridge has a paper. It's dissecting components of reward, liking versus wanting versus learning, and he talks about how the brain subsystems of liking, pleasure, wanting, drive to do different things, and then learning, how it changes its connectivity and behavior. They're all fairly distinct. Oh, okay. Adam, would you mind muting? Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. They're all fairly distinct systems in the brain. Oh, by the way, I'm so proud of us for figuring out the echo, I think. Yeah, I mean, these are all fairly distinct subsystems, and you can have kind of combinatorial combinations of, these two without that one, or this without those two, etc. So in that sense, it does seem like learning and pleasure are distinct. One thing that I think is very, very important in these sorts of discussions is the question of what can we offer to other people, to other groups, to society, that, I mean, we all agree that reducing suffering is very important. And to some extent that is just talking about it and advocacy and clarifying things. But I also, last weekend I went to the Effective Altruism Global Conference, and it was wonderful. And there were quite a few AI researchers there. And it seems to me that, reducing suffering today is, of course, very important. If we can do anything to help navigate the AI risk in the future, that could be very significant, and that could outweigh some other considerations in the long term. And it seems like, oh yeah, cool. So it seems like if we had kind of the universe's algorithm for pleasure and for pain, that could give us some advantage in terms of some of the problems that AI people talk about, the control problem, the value loading problem, etc. And it seems like, I would like, kind of, as a community, I do think that, collaboration and just kind of reaching out to other communities, and I mean, it's it's tough when it's so abstract, and I mean we're working on such a philosophical problem. But I do think it has very concrete implications for, at the very least, AI safety.
Fantastic, and I tend to agree there, Mike. I might just quickly plug the fact that we are also going to have an Effective Altruism Global Conference in Melbourne that's going to be from the 14th to the 16th. However, applications are closing pretty much today because I think we're running out of seats. But we have our David Pearce coming all the way down to Melbourne to come and speak about what the goals of EA Global could be, and whether we've really worked them out. Sorry, the effective altruism goals, and also to talk about the hedonistic imperative. David's going to be joining a panel with Peter Singer, who's also speaking at the conference. So anybody listening right now who wants to come to the Melbourne conference and thinks they can get here in time, yeah, please apply today. I mean, now. And hopefully we can accommodate you anyway. Yes, so is there anybody who wants to respond to suggestions about research right now? Like, for instance, what sorts of research we should prioritize with regard to Valence now? And, yeah. All right.
Before that, I had a few things to say about Mike's answer. So I'll start with that, maybe also say some things about that question. So one thing Mike said was about the difference between wanting, liking, and learning and things like that. So I very much agree with the fact that brains have many subsystems that may not be, that are not all the one thing. And so what Andre said about reinforcement learning is one general way to think about suffering and happiness, but it's certainly not the only one. I don't think that you need reinforcement learning to suffer. I think suffering can exist even in the absence of reinforcement learning in a cruder form. And reinforcement learning is one of many components of a mind that increases the degree of sophistication and the complexity of that mind and can make it more valenced from a certain perspective. So, but I think even just the simple act of like avoiding something, triggering resources to figure out how to get out of a situation, that doesn't need to involve learning, but it can be another form of like fear or suffering or anxiety and things like that in a very crude way. And so I think what I take the opposite view of Mike about the crispness of suffering. I think suffering is very fuzzy, and it consists of a big collection of things that brains do. And there's kind of a cluster of, we kind of cluster emotions, not unlike the factor analysis that Andres mentioned before. We kind of cluster emotions into categories that, like we think this kind of stuff is suffering, this kind of stuff is happiness, this kind of stuff is fear, and so on. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on under the hood, including reinforcement learning, aversive behavior, memories, like evaluative statements, like thinking this feels bad, this feels good, I want more of this. Preferences, action, inclinations, all kinds of stuff that happens in a brain. And like some of them go together, and we call the things that tend to be aversive and triggering negative reinforcement and triggering avoidance and triggering fear. Those kinds of things are the more pain-like emotions. And even within pain, we've got many subclasses, and like many pains feel different. And so like it's a big cluster of stuff, and we say certain things are more like pain than others. And so that implies that, like, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but like, so yeah, I totally agree that reinforcement learning is not all of what's going on. And so that this kind of view certainly allows for separating wanting from liking from learning. I think like liking is more appropriately conceived of as being the responses that an organism has to perceiving what psychologists call unconditioned stimuli, basically the intrinsic rewards, like the sweetness of sugar. And then reinforcement learning might actually be more the learning part. And through changing action inclinations, it may induce wanting. And so you can certainly separate out those components from this kind of viewpoint. The second thing about AGI safety, one of the reasons that I'm a little bit nervous about unpacking hedonic experience and studying neuroscience in general is because one byproduct of studying neuroscience is to accelerate our understanding of how the brain works, which can result in good consequences, but it can also speed up the development of HEI, especially neuromorphic HEI. And so we have to at least think about that as one side effect. Maybe we can say that since there are like tens of thousands of neuroscientists or whatever across the world already studying the brain, the marginal impact of a few people working on hedonic experience is relatively small toward accelerating HEI overall. But as a general principle, I think we should. I agree with Nick Bostrom that like on the whole, it would be better if HEI research were slower, so that humanity would have more time to figure out what to do about it. Although there are certainly a lot of cases where you want to speed up. For example, safety research and maybe other kinds of research should be sped up. So it's not a blanket statement. But the general point is just that I think we should consider the side effects of these kinds of explorations on the speed of HEI and the speed of technology, and also more generally, like the speed with which people can understand how suffering works. There are certainly downsides to that too. So we may discuss that more. And we also had HEI safety as a more general topic to talk about later. So maybe I'll save further thoughts on it until then. But I want to get back to the topic of HEI safety.
Yeah. Just a quick question to the group on that theme. It's echoey?
No.
Okay. Cool.
No.
Great. So the question that I have for all of you is, and this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit since reading Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. He's very strategic in kind of what to do, what should come first, kind of deal. And my question is, I mean, if we do successfully reverse engineer what valence is, that what makes certain experiences more pleasant and other experiences less pleasant. So, I mean, we succeed in that. Then what does responsible disclosure look like? Do we just publish? Do we put it out there and let the chips fall as it may? Both the potential benefits and the potential for abuse seem extraordinarily significant in this, and I'd like to hear what responsible disclosure means to all of you.
I would say first, maybe the fatal mistake is to even bring the topic up. I'm being facetious, but I think yeah, like disclosure is going to be a really difficult issue, and I'm hesitant to talk about this like at great length. However, there's like a few things I want to point out, and that is that thankfully, actually, our genetic and psychological makeup is such that most people have the capacity for wonderful, empathetic, loving kindness, and usually when people experience it, there tends to be a certain range of psychological transformations that happen over time. I mean, fairly neglected source of information for these kind of things is obviously like spiritual practices, where people specifically try to change their brain through various methods to acquire like intense loving kindness of various sorts. But we also see these with MDMA and MDMA therapy, which makes people much more like bonobo-like and pro-social. So I think there's probably a certain window of opportunity where if we develop, say, a long-lasting, sustainable MDMA-like substance or procedure, that actually that may go very smooth because people will try it out. They will know for themselves that it's like way better than normal life and that they're more inclined to help others. They will encourage their family members and their friends to do it, and it's going to be a wave that there might be some fanatical opposition against it, but at least it's going to be like human opposition, not something much more dangerous. And if we get to essentially spread it enough so that people who are like generally very hyper pro-social tend to be have a political power, I think we will be in a good position. That's kind of the optimistic sort of like way in which it may unfold to some extent, and kind of what I'm aiming for. But there's like other more dark scenarios and possibilities for terrible mistakes. David, do you have any thoughts? Or do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I mean the term existential risk means different things to different people. I mean, if one is, well, certain kinds of negative utilitarian supporters of David Benatar, better never to have been, people who think on balance life, Darwinian life is a terrible thing, will understand something very different by existential risks than life lovers. And I'm not sure if any serious research has been done into whether the actual study of existential risk is more likely to increase or diminish it from the life-loving perspective. As I said, I should add that David Benatar doesn't urge engineering Armageddon, but simply voluntary childlessness. But other people who think like him may have different views. One has to recall that perhaps almost 1 million people in the world each year take their own lives. A very significant number of them would probably take the rest of the world down with them. Yes, there are pros as well as cons to investigating existential risk. In fact, I would say that there is actually, from the perspective of, shall we say, the majority of life lovers, the very existence of suffering is a form of existential risk in an era of high technology, because some people would actually like to bring the world to an end. Just one more thing. When one is talking about post-human superintelligence, means very different things to very different people. For people who find credible the I.J. Good, Miri, Bostrom intelligence explosions, Singleton AGI will have a different notion of superintelligence from Kurzweilians, or, and this is the scenario I personally find most credible, that recursively self-improving organic robots are going to modify our own genetic source code in conjunction with AI and bootstrap our way into full spectrum superintelligence. I don't foresee a zombie putsch, or for that matter, digital computers are waking up. But here we come back to our earlier discussion on consciousness, phenomenal binding, and its computational importance, if any.
One thing I would add to the scenario Andre said, or a counterpoint, is you kind of elaborated the optimistic scenario, but the pessimistic scenario is that empathy right now is maladaptive in a certain sense. At least empathy for the powerless is maladaptive. It doesn't improve your reproductive success to care about people in Africa or minnows dying in the ocean, except in certain cases where you're part of a social group that values those things. So unless humanity values empathy enough, empathy could be eliminated as time goes on, either due to an evolutionary scenario like what Nick Bostrom describes in The Future of Human Evolution, where the most productive members of society get more resources, and their minds are increasingly optimized for productivity over all other values, or even more mundane ways. I mean, I like just some people, including myself, have compared like the global economy or capitalism to a paperclip maximizer of sorts, uncontrolled. The global economy is a literal uncontrolled superintelligence in a certain sense. It has a will of its own that's more than the will of any single individual as part of it, and people cannot necessarily control the direction that the economy goes, because like there are forces that that people may not like, but they kind of happen due to evolutionary and economic realities. And so the same sorts of things could happen in a more pronounced way once we have greater digital intelligence. So like one scenario is that empathy goes away because it's not adaptive to care about organisms other than trading partners or kin. And so I think part of where human empathy comes from is parenting impulses that get misapplied to other people or other animals, as well as sort of an evolutionary defect in our cognitive architecture, where we use theory of mind to predict others' behavior, but at the same time, when we simulate others' behavior, we stimulate the same sorts of feelings in ourselves. And in principle, an AGI could have a simulation module that's disconnected from the what it cares about module. And so like an AGI could simulate somebody in suffering without feeling anything as a result of that. And so for those reasons, it's quite possible that the agents that control our future will get rid of this maladaptive empathy. So yeah, or even if they retain empathy, the forces of global competition may just force people into a scenario where to stay afloat, they have to conform to these increasingly inhuman values. So all those kinds of things might also take place.
Excellent. Excellent. David, did you have any comments on that?
Yes. In terms of what can most people do now? Whether one is this is a much more mundane point. Whether one is an effective or an ineffective altruist, essentially one shouldn't be doing any harm. And yes, it would seem. Imagine if in 1943 or 44 we were discussing AI and existential risk or something. That would be jarring. And I think in the middle of this kind of animal holocaust in factory farms and slaughterhouses, I think, that is, if anything, I would say focus on shutting down death factories, closing slaughterhouses, that should be a priority. And then, yes, extending this to free-living, non-human animals. But having said that, if I believed in an intelligent explosion scenario, sort of AGI going boom, I can understand why others would take a different perspective. Everything else, including the experience of sentient beings today, would seem trivial in comparison.
Yeah. There's a tiny clarification I would like to add, and that is, like, it may sound, sort of like in the context of talking about far-fetched scenarios when like horrible things are happening, it sounds trivial or like not really even appropriate. So people may wonder, like, why would my interest and focus be, for example, like understanding like the fundamental substrate and the neurological and biomolecular signatures of bliss. And the answer is that if we find a way of essentially increasing, all else being equal, increasing the amount of bliss in an animal organism, even things such as factory farming actually could become not an ethical problem very, very quickly. For example, by generalizing some kind of device that you can put on animals in factory farms that is very cheap, could be funded by animal rights groups that would still allow people to eat meat if they desire, or like have factory farms, but where all of the animals there are never below hedonic zero. Likewise, like spreading this technology elsewhere. And the reason is that, I mean, empirically, essentially strong bliss seems to be a kind of a wild card that trumps all suffering. It essentially inhibits it. It may create a mixed experience of suffering and bliss, but that is not nearly as bad as pure suffering. So that's kind of like the pragmatic reason of like, hey, yeah, like why would you care about pure bliss when there's like all this awful suffering going on? That's the reason, because it may be an effective way of reducing suffering.
Yeah. I would add what Andre said that it could be that it's a lot safer to try servers by echoing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Is it good now? Still bad? Okay. Let me just try and unmute real quick. How's it now?
Okay, so Mike is telling me to say something, and I think so. It could be that pleasure is safer to research than pain. Yes, that is a really important point. It also may be perhaps easier as well, but like yes, much safer to research. You can speculatively come up with like pretty bad scenarios where like pleasure chambers are abused, and essentially you could imagine like if you have the sort of like a control remote for people, like by having the source of pleasure at your disposal but not at their disposal. But that's why I think like any kind of research of this sort, especially for like pleasure maximization, should be for safety reasons most of all open source. Although that may be controversial, I shouldn't just drop that as it's as a concluded idea.
Yeah, although there's a fair amount of overlap between pleasure and pain, and I mean all the fundamental research that goes into the neuroscience of hedonic experience, a lot of that will be shared between the two. So like instrumental technologies that are used to study one would transfer pretty easily to the other. As far as the factory farms, I'm more skeptical about using like devices to make animals happy, just because I expect it would be very expensive. And secondly, I think a lot of people might even see that as worse than factory farming in its own right. There were studies a few years ago about asking people, would you prefer if the animals you ate had their brains changed such that they didn't experience pain? And most people said that would be worse than current farming, mostly because of the ick factor, I guess. So both in terms of plausibility and cost, I'm more skeptical about that.
Okay, point taken.
Okay, so yeah, well, Stuart Armstrong brought up a point that he thinks that defining suffering and joy is a problem of high complexity. He thinks it's akin to defining other concepts in AI, but he thinks that it may be simple to define, valence in humans, but might not generalize easy. But I believe, David, you think that it could be the opposite.
Yes, I confess I I struggled with Stuart's view, but I suspect it follows from the kind of computational realism in which subjects of experience somehow emerge at different levels of computational abstraction. Whereas, yes, my perspective would be that we can actually, with electrode studies, we can actually isolate the molecular signature of core emotions, of fear and bliss, and one wouldn't expect to find any narrow or broad semantic content, or what philosophers call intentionality aboutness, that sure, thanks to the structure of our nervous systems, processes from the limbic system, they innovate the neocortex and paint on these experiences so that snakes, or our representation of snakes, seem intrinsically scary. But the actual basis of our core emotions may well turn out to be extremely simple, extremely strongly conserved in evolutionary terms. If you look back down inverted commas, the phylogenetic tree, vertebrates and beyond, the pleasure-pain axis, even simple flatworms, if you look at their dopamine and opioid systems, extremely strongly conserved, extremely simple. So yes, I would have a very different analysis. Sure, in terms of, yeah, we can find all manner of things delightful or scary in virtue of generative syntax in particular, but the actual, so to speak, heartlands of the soul, the real actual basis of our core emotions, is simple and it's evolutionarily ancient.
Yeah, just to add to that is like, I would be impressed if somebody can take a high dose of naloxone, which is a opioid antagonist, and do whatever they want and have pleasure. That is, like even if they have access to activating various parts of their cerebral cortex with electrode or whatever you want. If you took a high dose of naloxone and your reward circuitry is shut up, doesn't matter the level of complexity, doesn't matter anything else, you're just gonna have a bad time. And I think I mean that's an empirical claim. Yeah. Which
I think that's great.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
It's
Can
good.
you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. Yeah, I completely agree with that, Andres, and I think that is missed in a lot of these discussions. What I was going to say on Stuart's point, and just in reaction to this, I think people will disagree over whether valence is a tractable or real mystery, or just whether, thinking that it should have a real answer, until somebody publishes a theory which reliably explains it. Like, until that thing gets published, nobody will agree as to exactly what it is, and plenty of people will think it's not actually something that has an answer. It's just something that we're confused about, that we think we should have like a crisp answer to why some things do better than others, but for whatever reason that won't exist. So I mean, it's like show me the code, and it's going to take showing people the code to convince a lot of people, I think.
So I agree with Stuart's comment, and I'm one of those people who thinks valence does not have an answer, and I also don't think I could be convinced because it's not. I mean, it's more of a metaphysical question than an empirical question. Although certainly, if there was a very plausible account, it might change one's metaphysical intuitions. But as far as Stuart's point, that's sort of what I was saying before about there are many components of brains, and we cluster certain big systems as being certain emotions. So that's maybe a positive point for those who are concerned about the implications of understanding hedonic experience better, that brains are just very complicated, and there's what Les Strong is called complexity of value or disvalue with these systems, that any single component of a neural system is not crucial most of the time for whether it's morally relevant. Of course, there can be cases like with what Andreas was talking about, where if you put a monkey wrench in the wheels, like the whole thing, like a lot of stuff could turn off, and so that certainly might reduce a lot of the morally relevant operations. But I don't think it's as though we're going to find an equation that constitutes happiness and suffering, and then you can just create that very simply. It's always going to be a matter of complexity. So, so that's, I mean, that can be a good or bad thing depending on your perspective.
Do you want to describe how it could be a good or bad thing?
Oh, well, I mean, so that makes it, so that kind of like reduces the downside of people abusing the technology, but it also makes it harder to engineer happiness. Like, for example, this is going to be brought up later, but it would imply that the maximal amount of bliss is less, maximal amount of bliss per unit of computation would be lower than you might have thought, because like, insofar as we value complexity, you're going to need a complex system to create a blissful agent that has more than non-trivial value. So it just it reduces the kind of the extremes of what's possible as far as creating hedonic experience.
Yeah. So to just reiterate or kind of clarify the difference between our positions. It sounds like you would take the position that it's kind of like we're like Platonists that think there's this Platonic ideal of a dog, but if you poke and prod that, it just kind of gets really complex and fuzzy, and it devolves into complexity. And it turns out, in fact, there's no Platonic ideal of a dog, so far as we know. And whereas myself and I don't want to necessarily speak for Andreas and David, but I think we're more of the thought that it's like we're talking about electromagnetism, and it's maybe 1700. And there's this thing, and we can kind of pick out some patterns in how it works, but we really don't know how to really clarify what it is, how it works, like its exact dynamics. But it'll turn out to have exact quantifiable dynamics. So I think is it like the Platonic ideal of a dog or electromagnetism? I guess that's how I see the divide here. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, and to some extent, I also am an eliminativist on consciousness. So I think consciousness is ultimately what we make it to be. So if you want a very simple theory, like say the integrated information theory, then you can make it simple. So different people can have different intuitions about what's important. With electromagnetism, I think that's different from, like, the big disanalogy there is that it turns out that the dynamics of electromagnetism are quite simple, whereas the dynamics of at least a whole brain are very complex and will never be less complex, although you can make simple computer programs that do very rudimentary tasks. But I guess your position might be that the things that we care about within brains could be a very simple subset of the complex system that is the whole.
Yeah, so I mean, just as an intuition from, for example, following the electromagnetism metaphor. So I mean, in a particular medium with lots of charged particles, there's like just like a gazillion different interactions going on, and all sorts of like complex derivatives in the electromagnetic field. But nonetheless, as a whole, the system is either positively or negatively charged, and it's like everything sort of like boiled it down to a simple property with like a set of equivalence classes where like everything that has like equal overall charge counts as pretty much the same, even though inside it could be arbitrarily complex. So I think we're kind of, that extends the metaphor a little bit.
You could even develop a really simple way of doing that with humans. You have them rate how happy do you feel on a scale 1 to 5, and then anybody who has the same rating is in the same equivalence class. So, I mean, there are certainly ways to make it work, depending on what you think matters.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it's sort of like to add to the consciousness realism or not. So, like, I think David and I think Mike would agree that yes, like there is probably an objective. Well, Mike for sure. There's an objective amount of beliefs that you experience. I think we will come to an agreement when we use mind melding. I mean, that will be like a very demonstrable agreement where a person who has been, for example, polishing a particular positive state could be like the standard rod, where like if you want to know what like happiness 7.5 is, you just connect to Rob because Rob is in 7.5, and then it's sort of like a standardizer. Simply because, yeah, I mean, again, this brings back like phenomenal binding. There is a aspect of the physical system that you are that is the bound object of consciousness, rather than it being like an sort of like up to you to decide how do you divide the system and what do you consider the particular information processing that is going on there. But yeah, I'm kind of curious, like what kind of thing would you imagine, Brian, that would change your mind? What would be like the one piece of evidence, experience, or theory that would make you think more along these lines?
It would mostly be a theoretical argument along the lines of some metaphysical theory being simpler, because I think consciousness, as Dennett also says, consciousness is sort of a smoke and mirrors game. So you can't really trust what your brain tells you. I think a lot of what we think of as valence is our brains telling us certain things, or consciousness in general is our brains tell us that we're conscious, and when we see a rich visual scene in front of us, our brain has a lot of data, and then our brain makes the judgment that this is a rich visual scene. And so, like with a lot of these questions, you can't trust your brain. It's an analogy would be optical illusions. Like, don't believe everything you see, because our brains are built to give us kind of, Marvin Minsky calls them like high-level interfaces to the more complex reality. We have like a series of very simple concepts that our brains manipulate at a high level that represent much more complex underlying features, and we mistake these simple like icons on our computer for being the bits and bytes that are actually underneath. And so, so I think we can't really trust experiences in that way, because it's very natural that our brains will tell us that our experiences are genuine. So what I would be more convinced by would be like problems with the physicalist picture, the picture of just physical systems without any additional ontological properties. So if that run into problems, or if there was an argument that you could actually have ontological consciousness in a way that fit very neatly into physicalist ontology, and very naturally, and like was very important to the overall explanation of why things happen and why we declare ourselves to be conscious and things like that, then I might be persuaded. But given that those things seem so implausible, in terms of my own judgment, I think it's very likely that type A physicalism, as it's called, is correct, the Dennettian view, that there is no ontological thing called consciousness. I reserve some modesty because there are many smart people who disagree with that, and it's very common to think you're be more confident than you should be. So overall, I would admit the possibility of these other things being the case as well.
Okay.
Although you could make the argument that if my view is true, the implications are more severe, so we should assume my view is true.
Yes, I really struggle with eliminativism. I mean, sure, one can be told that it's not really an oasis in the desert, it's a mirage. But what if someone tells you that there's not even a mirage? Sorry, I just hit a button there. Yeah, I'm a physicalist too, at least provisionally. As you know, there are different forms of physicalism. It depends on one's analysis of the nature of the physical and the account one gives of binding. But yeah, the radical forms of eliminativism about consciousness, I confess, I really struggle with. I mean, it's just pain is one of the most basic things there is, and one knows, something simple like the SCN9A gene, nonsense mutations, complete inability to experience any form of pain. Other alleles associated with high or a low pain sensitivity, and this is independent of any behavioral manifestation. One can be paralyzed, and if someone says that you're not really in agony, it's an illusion, your brain is playing tricks, I struggle. I mean, sure, one should be, someone who says that they can directly experience God punishing them or something, yes, they're smuggling too much in the way of theory. But the raw experience of pain or agony, someone who says that they're an eliminativist, I genuinely do struggle.
Yeah, just I was going to add a brief thing, which is that sort of to say that, hey, don't trust the existence of your experience. The brain plays a lot of tricks. My standard response to that is, well, how do you know what a brain is if it isn't through like a network of experiences you have had and trusted? Sort of like to even be able to construct the concept of like a mind-independent external reality, you need to have trusted the existence of your experience to begin with. So I would much sooner doubt the existence of brains than doubt the existence of my consciousness.
Well, it depends how you're defining experience. I mean, suppose you took something that you consider to be a zombie. Certainly that zombie has zombie experiences of the world, and it can deduce that brains exist and all those things. So I do believe that there are things that could be called experiences. It's just, it's more of a strategic question of how to be more clear. Like Dennett says in the paper, Finding Qualia, that like there are certainly ways to define qualia that are very coherent and mapped to neurological details, but people get confused when you use that language, and so it like as a way of making yourself more clear, it's perhaps better to say that qualia don't exist, just to force people to understand the difference in what you're saying. So I mean, I certainly agree that there are systems that have the perceptions and do computations to understand the world and all those things, and have experiences that I regard have operations go on in the brain that I regard as very bad, and that they regard as very bad. And so I just use the eliminativist terminology to kind of clarify that's a high-level concept that we're attributing to the system. So I like to compare consciousness with justice or equality or beauty or something. Those are very complicated things that we attribute to systems. And it's just that we have a much more raw feeling of consciousness than we have a feeling of justice. Although many people, like especially moral realists, also think that justice is something that's maybe even ontological. But I just think consciousness is a much more persistent, like the idea that consciousness is a concrete thing with an ontological existence is just more persistent than all the other ontological confusions, or Platonist confusions, if you want to use that.
Yeah, cool. So, right, so we have some research into how the brain computes experience, and we have reasonably good technology today to sort of peer inside the head and see what's going on. fMRI, magnetoencephalography, and various other sort of brain scanning techniques and technologies. Based on what we know now about the trajectory of brain and biology imaging technology in the next, 5 to 10 years, where do you see the project of empirically informed models of like valence, or let's go to consciousness, or let's just stick with valence. What kinds of experiments, given the technologies and the data we have today and what we may have in the near future, do you think we should be focusing on to bring more clarity to the question of what is valence and what's important about it?
I can say a little bit about that. I guess it touches back on something that I mentioned before. That this is really a question of if valence is a certain pattern or a class of patterns in a data set. And I think that's general enough that maybe it's not too objectionable to anyone here. Then what sorts of approaches can we use to help define what data set we're talking about? And then what kind of approaches can we use to build a heuristic to find the pattern within those data sets? So just to kind of clarify where people are, to my understanding at least, Brian and I would tend to agree on data sets that so Brian has mentioned Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, and I think that's a really good, interesting place to start, with some certain caveats as far as Scott Aronson has a pretty good critique of it, but I think the outline of the theory is salvageable, at least. I treat it as kind of a black box with a certain input and a certain output. But anyway, that's in kind of the more technical aspects of my research. But so we would both see maybe integrated information theory as like one contender as far as how to generate a data set of a conscious system. And then we could try and find patterns in the data set. And then Andres and David and I would agree that there is going to be this kind of clear pattern in whatever ends up as being a conscious system. And we disagree on whether a brain emulation could ever be conscious in theory, or and some other things. But we're looking for this kind of clear pattern within our data sets. So as far as empirically, like what can we do to generate and test hypotheses? I think it's, for me, speaking personally, it's about searching out quantitative theories of consciousness. For instance, integrated information. Virgil Griffiths has a version, Max Tegmark has a version, and then it's kind of a guess and check from there that the complexity of the brain is staggering, and I don't think anyone here would disagree with that. But I do think that there's interesting things you can do if you can just kind of make an educated guess and then figure out clever ways to test it. So, like, I'm a hardcore patternist. I think it's all about patterns, and so it's a question. Okay, so let's hypothesize it's pattern X. Can we find a clever way to try to inject pattern X back into a brain and see what happens, or use various brain scanning technologies? Probably, Casali has this protocol called PCI, Perturbational Complexity Index, that I'm looking at to test a specific hypothesis. But Yeah, it's all about. I don't think that we'll have kind of this wealth of knowledge that we can just data mine and figure it out for a long, long, long time. But I think we are to the point where we can make educated guesses and hopefully be very specific, and then go into the technical capacities that we do have and test them and refine them from there.
I'd just like to ask this one. I mean, how can we, what, if we were trying to determine like a test for a theory of valence that was more about fundamental properties of physics, whether you're a Strawsonian physicalist or a full panpsychist, what would an experiment look like that would be able to test for such things, even now or in the future? And how would you then determine the difference between a model which only needed to rely on the emergent sort of information theory patternist approach and wouldn't have to also look at a possible more foundational fundamental approach? What would an experiment look like in order to test for these sorts of things?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a question of like kind of is it a fundamental property of physics? And I guess the question is how does that cash out empirically? And so my focus is on patterns. And Andres and I, he ducked away a little bit, but we've actually talked about like if it's some sort of vibration harmonic, then maybe we could test that with various molecules. So that would be a concrete example. Yeah, I don't know if that clears anything up, but
I think David Pearce might have had like an experiment in mind. Is that something you'd like to talk about now, David? Is it like...
Yes, it'll take us some way away from effective altruism, but yes, anyone who isn't just talking woo when it comes to quantum theory must explain precisely how this cashes out. And in the case of phenomenal binding, if it is really the case that quantum coherent superpositions of distributed feature processors underlie both local and global phenomenal binding, it must be possible to do experiments to test this. And one way to do so would be to actually construct a neuronal network with train it up on various stimuli together. Well, I mean, there are a number of challenges there. On the standard approach, when, for example, one apprehends particular perceptual objects, there is this synchrony of neuronal firing of distributed feature processors. Whereas if phenomenal binding is based on quantum superpositions, then yes, one will be able to, in principle, at any rate, detect the non-classical interference signature. In fact, there are three possibilities. One, that no interference signature at all is detected. The unitary dynamics, Schrödinger dynamics, breaks down. This is what Penrose, Hameroff, and others have conjectured. The other is that we do actually find the non-classical signature of neuronal superpositions, but it's just complete random noise. After all, any credible account of neuronal superpositions in the brain, thermally induced decoherence times of something like femtoseconds or less, which is intuitively far, far too short to be relevant to consciousness. Yeah, my own working hypothesis is that when we can actually do the relevant experiments, yes, we will find a perfect structural match between the phenomenology of our minds and the underlying physics. David Chalmers, on the other hand, would say that no, we're never going to find the perfect match, and dualism is true. But if we want to save physicalism, we're going to have to make some pretty dramatic adjustments to our conceptual scheme, because at the moment, orthodox materialist neuroscience has no account, A, of why consciousness exists at all, B, how it is phenomenally bound, C, how it's possible for consciousness to have the causal efficacy to talk about its existence as now, and D, what explains this teeming diversity of different experiences we have. And that's an awful lot of ignorance, even though I am at least cautiously optimistic we're going to be able to phase out biology of suffering. Essentially, we do not understand the brain.
Andreas, have you got any comments about like the suggested approaches to testing what what valence is, and to what level we should be sort of looking, whether it's at a physicalist level or more of a patternist, emergent level?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, for sure, like valence is causally relevant. I think it definitely wouldn't be epiphenomenal or just an emergent phenomena. That said, like I think Mike's actually conceptual framework is probably pretty good. The thing I would add to it is that the data set needs to be bound ontologically, phenomenally bound, which is like perhaps one additional constraint over what other people might take it as. Other people might say you only need the various pieces of information and the relationship between them in the classical sense. I would add that in order for valence to even arise, you require the unity between the various components at the level of consciousness. But once you have like a phenomenally bound consciousness, then yes, I think like it's actually a matter of what are the various interrelationships between the various components of it, such as, to give you an example, there seems to be certain constraints in consciousness that are not easy to map to any physical constraint. I think eventually we will map them to quantum constraints. Right now we have no idea what they map into. But one of these constraints, for example, is that you cannot experience yellow and blue simultaneously. You cannot locally bind yellow and blue. You cannot locally bind red and green. These are like laws of consciousness. For whatever reason, you can verify this empirically over and over again. You can, which is done by when you actually define the state space of phenomenal color. If anybody is interested, that's a CL lab. It's been done with psychophysics, and indeed, green and red are in opposite sides of the spectrum. So I think the proper level of resolution would be to understand what is the relationship between various qualia, how they interact with each other, and out of a set of the relationships between the qualia present in a conscious experience, there can be a lot of dissonance where by the laws of consciousness they are not supposed to be overlapping, or they cannot overlap, and yet there are forces that are trying to make it overlap. I think that probably might be a sort of the general direction in which I'm like looking into. So it is patternistic, but patternistic with a constraint of phenomenal binding. And I mean, neuroscience is a very important component here, but most of all, it will be changing the consciousness of people and self-reports, and potentially professional psychonauts, like people who are really rational and really know what they're doing, who modify their brain in a way that doesn't affect their memes. They don't become fanatical in one way or another. They can sustain the project, but they will have, like, you will require people who affect their own mind and study themselves to carry the project.
Brian?
I don't think consciousness is testable because the brain, as I said, plays tricks on us. So anything that we think that we observe is just plausibly the brain telling us what to think. So, I mean, I do think it's a fundamental metaphysical problem that there are certain metaphysical questions that can't be tested. But as a more practical thing, as a more practical matter, like it certainly is the case that we care about the kinds of things that people report about their consciousness. That's a big part of what we regard as the emotional experience of a person. So, in terms of practical achievements, you certainly can bear fruits by doing these kinds of studies of what people report under various circumstances. I just don't think it establishes anything metaphysical, but it within the realm of we all want to reduce suffering, it certainly can have utility in that regard.
Well, okay, so, but it's been suggested that valence research would have like a potential impact into the way that we sort of develop AI and imagine the human enhancement project. So it seems like, having a solid understanding of valence would have quite a lot of impact into how we go about developing high-impact technologies, human enhancement, animal enhancement, and artificial intelligence, super intelligent projects, or projects to kick off a singularity, so to speak. So it seems like it's gonna be very difficult to do, according to some opinions here. What can we do to, I don't know, put the pedal to the metal, so to speak, with regard to researching valence?
Yeah, well, I think so it's kind of a Pascal's wager as far as, do we assume it's a tractable problem? That there is a downside to assuming that if it turns out to not be tractable, but there seems to be an enormous upside. I guess one way to put this would be the Kolmogorov complexity of it's like, how complex of a program would you have to write to specify or to derive valence within any arbitrary system? And I think it would be a small number of bytes, and Brian would think that it would be a large number of bytes. That's a maybe I'm putting words in Brian's mouth, but yeah, I guess I'm a big fan of assuming that it is a tractable problem, and I guess the question is, how do we get resources to study it? No matter what nature of what we eventually figure out about valence. Like if all of us here agree it's important to study, and that we can make some progress as far as clarifying the issue, at least. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to do more than that. But I think it's about reaching out to sort of adjacent communities, to the AI safety community, to the EA community, especially animal welfare, and it's, I mean, so Abraham Lincoln has this this wonderful quote, and I'm gonna. I'm sorry. What's that?
I think it's apocryphal, but that's okay.
Oh yeah. It definitely could be. So the quote ascribed to Abraham Lincoln is something to the fact that, if I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 7 hours sharpening my axe. And I think for a lot of problems in the world, I mean, if we understood valence better, we would be much more effective at solving them. So in this sense, I'm trying to sharpen the axe, so to speak. And I do think that's just all about reaching out, and not necessarily in the name of advocacy, but in the name of collaboration. That like I think that Valence research has something to offer AI researchers, and I think Valence research has something to offer other communities. So I guess I see a very productive kind of interaction being that looking for collaboration and making the effort to reach out.
My opinion on this question is I don't think Valence research is the highest priority for two reasons. One is the downsides that we've discussed and like the potential to accelerate neuroscience and so on. But secondly is that in general, I think a lot of philosophical questions are better left to the future to figure out. Bostrom makes the same point in his book. Toward the end, he talks about philosophy with a deadline, and he says a lot of conventional philosophical questions could be better solved by an HEI, and so what's more important is to get society in the right place and our strategy for going forward in the right place, rather than figuring out the hard questions. I disagree with that to some extent, because I think some questions, like we've been talking about with consciousness, can make a huge difference to what trajectories we want to push for. For example, if I thought only biological life could suffer, then I might have different priorities about advocacy regarding the risks from space colonization and things like that. And certainly other kinds of metaphysical questions about anthropic reasoning and these other basic decision theory, etc. Those issues can make a big difference to how we proceed. So I don't want to say that philosophy as a whole is not important. Often it's the opposite. But I think once you reach a certain point, you kind of, especially with something like consciousness, where it's like probably thousands of philosophers have spent a lot of time on the question. Almost everybody who thinks about the issue is pretty puzzled, and there's like wide disagreement from thinking. I mean, some philosophers think that only humans are conscious. Some philosophers think that the whole universe is conscious, and there's a huge spectrum of positions in between those. And like at some point, you may want to bracket the question and move on to other strategic areas. So for both those reasons, I think on the whole, we should mainly focus on strategy for moving HEI development in better directions. Keeping in mind that talking about consciousness is certainly something that people should be aware of and thinking about as far as how it affects where they're going to push. But I wouldn't say it's the most important area for novel research.
So, similar to what's been described as a coherent extrapolated volition or aggregated volition, according to others, should we be creating like a more sort of narrow AI to research to help solve the valence issue, along with friendliness, in order to develop like to sort of design the right type of superintelligence that would be more amenable to human and animal and agent flourishing in the universe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely doable. I mean, narrow AI is certainly instrumental in even like basic psychology research nowadays. I mean, like machine learning, identifying what are the causally relevant features for a phenomenon is like everyday, very common thing. It's like billions of years away from anything such as like general intelligence. Nonetheless, I mean, with autonomous drones, for example, you can definitely, I mean, this is something David Pearce talks about, so I'm kind of representing him here, but you can definitely imagine autonomous drones, not too far into the future, actually having an encoded notion of a way of calculating at least an rough approximation of the level of suffering of animals using all sorts of biometrics. where potentially you can detect animals that are in high suffering and have a set of protocols for how to help them, either through genetic engineering or drugs or stimulation or anything of the sort. So, I mean, definitely, like, narrow AI can play a profound role in increasing balance worldwide.
Would you agree there, Brian? It sounds like you would.
Well, to some extent, I mean, it depends how you define AI, and in some sense, any computer technology is a form of AI. But I would de-emphasize the new flashy technologies for the most part, because I think a lot of problems are better solved with the boring regular forms of human activity. And like with wild animal suffering, I mean, it's much easier to change ecosystems in the ordinary ways that we already know than to develop expensive technological solutions. So, like, I think just, humans already have massive impacts on the environment, and figuring out which ways that we're changing the environment are good and bad could be a lot cheaper than trying to do more targeted engineering of ecosystems, just because of the scale. Like, especially if there's something that we're doing that's good for wild animals, and we're doing it anyway, then it's going to be pretty cheap. And whereas drones are pretty expensive, and you might only affect the big land vertebrates anywhere, whereas a lot of wild animal suffering is in the form of small invertebrates. So on the whole, I think simple, dumb, boring stuff is often the better approach. Keeping in mind that in the long term, certainly, I mean, AGI will determine the future of the light cone, assuming that human civilization doesn't descend. But in the short term, I think it's good to stay more grounded in practical approaches.
Right. So I think we're approaching 10:18. I don't know what time it is in your time zones now, but I think David Pearce, it's all past his bedtime, and he might have already gone to bed. But there's a number of points we haven't really discussed yet. I'd really like it if I could interview each of you at some point. If you're all still happy to continue, I'm happy to continue until everybody falls off their perches. But there's no coercion to do so. Yeah. There's a couple of points that Mike Johnson actually wrote in our document of what questions to ask or what talking points we should have. And okay, so one of them is, what order of magnitude is the theoretical potential for mood enhancement? If anybody of here has got any opinions of how far we can take mood enhancement for every different type of agent, what's possible for just like plain biologically evolved humans, and what's possible with augmented humans and post-human, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I have an intuition pump, at least for this, which is, I mean, we have quite a lot of accounts of like very serious and honest people reporting having had experiences where they would describe at least 1,000-fold increase in intensity and overall amount of bliss that they experience. And as I was mentioning, like, there's a reason to think that specifically 5-MeO DMT with MDMA may be perhaps even the theoretical limit for brains of our basic design to achieve. I mean, 5-MeO DMT is the most powerful psychedelic that essentially makes you reliably experience psychological death. If you take it alone, it's usually a very horrible, very dreadful experience. But apparently, if you combine it with MDMA, it takes all or most of the side effects, such as psychological dread, completely away and straight shoots you into a positive ego death. And ego deaths, I think, are for sure like the most intense experiences people have, because you don't have to additionally represent your body, and it's like more your consciousness is a bright ball of light with not quite sort of like representational content as such. Is more something that people might describe as consciousness itself, which may sound absurd to people, but it's an experience you can have. That said, right now it doesn't seem like something like that would be very functional, but I suspect that the entities in the future that we engineer will be many orders of magnitude more blissful, will be the equivalent of what we can only imagine as gods right now, each and every one of them.
So I mentioned before that I think the bound is lower. Like I expect that maybe a few orders of magnitude would probably be the limit relative to maybe most people's ideas of what should constitute happiness and suffering. So there's often this discussion of, well, I mean, there are various ways to put it. So one thing is if you made a very simple algorithm that was extremely blissful in some sense. So you may strip away a lot of the complexity of a mind and make some much simpler happiness processing system. A lot of people reject that idea because they think it's not like something that simple. It doesn't matter as much as something with more complex emotions. And so I think there's some validity to that because we tend to value hedonic experience more if it's accompanied by what Carl Schulman calls more bells and whistles. Basically, it has more depth and there's more going on if it's a more complex system. So there's some extent to which if you take the view that complexity matters to a non-trivial degree, then you're going to have to have something fairly complex. Although you could say maybe you think that the large portion of our brains devoted to visual processing is not very important morally, and so you could eliminate that part and have more of the hedonic hotspots and things like that. So there's certainly room to increase the what we would consider the intensity of an experience, but I doubt it would be more than a few orders of magnitude, unless you take the view that a very simple algorithm, say something you could even write in a computer programming language, would be just as good as the more complex versions that we have in our brains. And in that case, you could have, I don't know, 10, 100 orders of magnitude more efficiency, but I think most people would say that that matters less.
Well, one question before Andreas has to leave soon. What do you think are the counterintuitive sources of suffering, and also, bliss, that we don't necessarily take into account?
That's a good question. Yeah, counterintuitive sources of suffering and bliss. So suffering counterintuitively is essentially if there's a set of patterns in our consciousness, and this is just from personal observation, so may not generalize, but essentially that suffering doesn't actually need to be a particular pattern on its own, but rather it suffices to have a series of interruptions from patterns that you're used to and are familiar to produce suffering. And I think it's actually not something that is only sort of like something that gets triggered once you're like not understanding your experience, for example, because there's too much noise. But I think it's like itself the very interruption of patterns that you're used to and naturally unfold in your consciousness that create the suffering. But I'm not very satisfied with that account. And the counterintuitive sources of bliss. Yes, I think actually deep sleep may be quite a bit of bliss that we just don't remember. And I think it has to do with essentially trimming important parts of our experience. It's sort of you become, it's a state of consciousness that is memory-less, but I don't think it's experientially absent. And I can only guess this is the case because of essentially being at the edge between dreaming and deep sleep, and just like wishing so much that I wasn't dreaming and I was more into the deep sleep consciousness thing. But that could definitely be an illusion. So yeah, I wouldn't set that set in stone. But I would place quite a lot of value in understanding the valence of deep sleep. Yeah. Can't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah. Since Andreas, you have to go. Is there any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you say. Yeah. Well, a concluding remark is so right now. I mean, today I'm gonna close the survey. It's been out for a while, but like if you want to contribute to the consciousness research that I'm onto, definitely log into qualiacomputing.com. Take the survey. It says that I closed it already, but I haven't. So, I mean, if you're listening to this, definitely go and do it if you're curious. And yeah, I mean, generally speaking, if anybody in the audience or people who are like hearing this after that are like interested in valence research and like trying to reverse engineer the computational properties of consciousness, I'm very open to like having collaborators and people to do projects with. So that's something to keep in mind. Qualiacomputing.com. And yeah, well, thanks so much, Adam, for organizing this, and I'll stay in touch. And,
absolutely, it's been a pleasure having you.
Cool. See you guys.
Thanks, Andreas. See ya.
See you guys.
Yeah. So this isn't the end for everybody. If you guys want to answer the question of like, what do you think isn't, you know, necessarily obvious about valence, suffering, or bliss? What are the counterintuitive sources and aspects of suffering that you want to talk about? Then yeah, I think it's a pretty good topic. So you guys want to answer that question?
I probably don't have too much to say other than the counterintuitive nature of consciousness in general. I guess it would be mainly a psychology topic, and probably people have written a lot about introspection accounts of their own experiences. So I would mainly defer to other people on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Brian has written some things on insects as a kind of counterintuitive, surprising source of possibly a lot of suffering. I don't know if he has any further comments on that, or.
Yeah, that was another topic. We could get into that if you want. Yeah, it started in 2005. I was learning about animal rights, and I read in a book that insects might be able to suffer. And until that point, actually, before 2005, I thought even non-humans probably didn't suffer, which is one reason I didn't care about them as much. But realizing that insects might be able to suffer was a big transformation in my worldview, because insects are all over. There were spiders eating bugs in my basement, and like there was a lot more suffering in the world than I had imagined. So at the time, I wasn't really sure about the matter. I thought maybe 20% chance that I would care about insects because they seemed so simple and things like that. Over time, as my views on consciousness have evolved, I've grown to realize that I'm pretty sure that I care about insects, although certainly to somewhat of a less degree than then I care about one insect less than one human, just due to the complexity and degree of cognitive operations going on. But I do think it's pretty clear that insects instantiate simpler forms of processes that we consider relevant in humans. Even fruit flies with 100,000 neurons can do reinforcement learning and predict whether they'll get a shock based on odors and things like that. They have memories and can engage in like avoidance behavior. So a lot of the basic things that you might think of as being relevant to pleasure and pain show cruder, simpler forms in insects. And there are somewhere around 10 to the 18th to 10 to the 19th insects on the planet at any given time. So say roughly 1 billion insects per human. So even if you count insects a lot less than humans, the total number could be quite substantial. The total effective number of insects, given their weight. So personally, I think an insect matters not less than a few orders of magnitude of a human. So I try to avoid hurting insects where possible. I've got a piece actually on WikiHow. I wrote an article, How to Avoid Hurting Insects, that has various suggestions. Some of the big ones are avoiding silk, which involves boiling or gassing tens of thousands of silkworms per dress. Avoiding shellac, where it's feasible. That's a substance that's made from lac bugs, and it takes many thousands of bugs to create a small amount of shellac. That's in various products, including like wood finishes and some candy shells and things like that. And other things like if you drive during the rain, you may drive over worms or slugs or other things that are crossing the road. It's common to see lots of squished worms on the road after a rainstorm, or even on the sidewalk. And so those are various ways that you can personally reduce the harm that you cause to bugs. And then also thinking more broadly about the suffering of bugs in the wild. Most insects live, say, weeks or months, if they survive to adulthood. And because insects are what's called R-selected, they have a large number of offspring relative to the number that survive to adulthood. And so that means most insects die within days or weeks of birth, probably in painful ways such as starvation, cannibalism, parasitism, just ordinary dehydration or physical injury. And then even the bugs that survive to adulthood, they also die potentially painfully after a few months at most. And so for most species, there are a few bugs that live many years, but those are the exceptions. And so like that's a lot of suffering that occurs naturally in the wild. And even if we help elephants, as David Pearce has proposed, or other big animals, it's a lot harder to help the insects. So for the moment, I think it's generally better not to be born as an insect because you have such a short life, and even the life is not guaranteed to be that great, but then the short life is followed by potentially painful death. So as a general principle, I think it's better to reduce the number of insects that exist. So I've written some pieces discussing what the implications of that view are for various environmental policies, such as whether crop cultivation is good or bad, whether global warming is good or bad relative to insects, and various other issues like that. One concrete proposal I came up with was, if you live in an area where, if you have a lawn, you could consider replacing it with a gravel lawn or some other abiological kind of lawn material. And the idea there is that the more plant food exists, the more insects will exist. And so when you have a lawn, you'll have insects that eat the grass. So if you prevent creating the grass in the first place, then you'll reduce the number of insects that are born. So there are complications with the goal of reducing insects. I mean, one is that in certain cases, it may interfere with other human values, and it may, for example, it might increase environmental destruction in certain cases, and that could be bad for other reasons, such as increasing instability in the world, especially if we're talking about like farming using lots of water or climate change or something like that. But the one benefit of the gravel lawn approach is that lawn maintenance may be a net source of greenhouse gases rather than a net sink. So it could even be good for the environment to replace your lawn if you have done a lot of mowing and fertilizing. So the point of that discussion is to say that it's not always the case that if you want to reduce the number of insects, you're going to go up against other things that people care about. Sometimes you can help the environment and reduce insects at the same time. Another important case is with climate change itself. I think it's plausible that climate change will increase wild animal suffering on balance because many people expect that climate change will increase the number of insects that exist because insects thrive in warmer climates and insect growth rates are roughly proportional to temperature above some threshold. And so insects can have more breeding seasons and maybe survive the winter. And so, like in general, there are various ways that global warming might increase insect populations on balance. And so if that's the case, then maybe climate change would also be a bad thing from the perspective of insect suffering. But in general, I think these kinds of questions in what I call applied welfare biology are important to study further because there's a lot of uncertainty about the sign of like whether a given environmental impact is good or bad. The term welfare biology is from a Australian, I think he's Australian economist, Yu Kwang Eng. He wrote a paper towards welfare biology about suffering in the wild, and that was one of the major inspirations for my writing about the topic. He concludes that suffering outweighs happiness in nature for the same reason that I said, because a lot of organisms have many offspring, most of which die very young. And so chances are you're going to be one of those that dies pretty soon. And especially with insects, even if you are one of the winners who survives to adulthood, you still die after a few weeks or months. So those are some points on insects. And then one last thing is, so I think I think it's important to increase concern for insects in the short term, so that people take the issue more seriously. Although there's also a concern that people might misinterpret insect advocacy. So, for example, a lot of times if you advocate and say that wild animals matter, and you just say that message, people would assume that means let's stop interfering with wild animal habitats, let's leave them alone, let's preserve the Asian tigers and things like that. Whereas that might actually be a bad thing because wild animals suffer so much. So with insects, I would hope people wouldn't take away the message because insects matter, we should leave them alone, and we should make sure to preserve their habitats against human interference and things like that. The message should be insects matter and they suffer a lot in the wild, so let's figure out how to address that problem in a way that doesn't just leave them alone. Humans have reduced insect populations maybe by 50%, one study says, over the last few decades. And if you think insects suffer a lot, then that could be quite a good thing. So it's not a simple case of leave nature alone as the solution. And one other reason that insect advocacy can be important is because the kinds of the insect suffering issue is analogous to others that will emerge in the future when it comes to digital suffering. So insects are sort of simple creatures that are normally disregarded by the bigger humans when they're doing other things. And by analogy, there will be, and I think even already are, but in a much diminished form, simple processes in computational systems that are basically ignored by the humans who create them. And so promoting concern for the little creatures that can't speak for themselves and that may not even have the same degree, and certainly don't have the same degree of fully fleshed out self-awareness that we have, can be an important precedent to set for the future as we start to see more digital, simple digital processes that still may count as suffering.
Excellent. Mike?
Yeah, so a lot of interesting points there. definitely agree that wild animal suffering is important, and by animal, we should also include our circle of empathy to anything that can experience pain, that any conscious system, I guess I would say. I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty here, and we have to, we have to A, work to minimize the uncertainty and chip away at it, and B, act although things are uncertain. That if acts today have impacts on things that can suffer, certainly we should take that into account, even if we're not exactly certain how much things suffer and what kind of things can suffer. So I guess we could take a Bayesian approach to probability of something, if something can suffer, and our probability distribution as far as like how much each thing is worth. And I do want to mention there is so if we take a look at like the opioid system, which is responsible for it seems responsible for a great deal of the pleasure that we experience. It's conserved among all brains, that even like little flatworms have it. C. elegans has it. Like they only have 302 neurons, but they still have opioids. Like endorphins would be an example of this. So, so that is an interesting data point. I do think Brian's point about digital emulations being potentially very important. I completely agree. And if we only ascribe, even a 5% or even a 1% chance that they could suffer, Anders Sandberg has this wonderful paper on this topic, and I mean the first brain emulations, not to be too grim about it, but they'll probably be insane, since we probably won't get them right out of the bat, or just out of the gate. That we're gonna have to try a brain emulation and then see how it isn't working right, and then iterate and improve it. And I mean, if we try a bunch of these at a time, and if we run them 1,000 times faster than real time, I mean, this can really add up. So I do think that in that sense, it is very important to be on top of things before we get into that, and that's what I'm really hoping. And I mean, just as far as sort of counterintuitive or unknown sources of suffering in the world, we really don't know. That's the theme of this specific answer. But then again, I mean, it could be that some very counterintuitive scenarios could be the case. That if you go on a binge drinking spree and kill a bunch of your cells, then is that the sort of destruction of complexity that is somehow suffering? I don't know. It's hard to say. So yeah, that's kind of my angle on this question. And I mean, the way I put my question is, do we know like about 90% of the suffering in the world, or about 0.001% of the suffering in the world? And at this point, I don't think we can confidently say we're closer to one than the other, really. I kind of hope that we're closer to knowing more rather than less, but there's certainly a big cloud of uncertainty, and we just need to buckle down and study it, figure it out.
So that really highlights the importance of valence research, I guess, for whatever philosophical attitudes we may come into this with. I guess it really depends on empirically informed observations that we can rely on to, I guess, guide or change our minds about the philosophy. Yeah. If like it, for instance, there's anything like, I think we've like gone for quite a while. It's been fantastic. Is there any like concluding remarks that either of you, both of you, would like to make at this time?
Yeah, I wanted to plug two other topics quickly, although I don't know if Mike wants to go first. But so one thing I was going to talk about was HEI safety and my thoughts on that, and then the other was thoughts on practical work that people can do and what causes I think are the best to support, things like that. So on the first topic, HEI safety. So Mike kind of hinted at this also. I think HEI is one of the highest leverage places to focus our efforts. In the past, it was a little more so because it was such a neglected topic. In the last year or so, a lot of attention has been brought to the issue by Boston Spoke and Elon Musk and various other people. But I still think relative to the size of the problem, or even like relative to climate change or something, it's much less talked about. So it's possible that shaping the trajectory of how HEI is developed is a pretty important leverage point. So a lot of people, when they encounter this issue, and especially in the popular media, the focus is on AIs killing humans as the most important part. Let's figure out how to prevent AIs from killing humans. So I tend to think that's an overly simplistic way to think about it because, I mean, from a broader perspective, who's to say that humans are the best species to have around? Like maybe, in principle, there could be HEIs that we prefer to humans, and in general, it's an us versus them, in-group, out-group kind of mentality to say we want to preserve our kind, not let their kind take over. So just on the pure impulse to prevent humans from being taken over, I think that's not the right way to look at it. But there are reasons to care about HEI safety from a broader, more cosmopolitan perspective. So in particular, the main concern that I have about unsafe AIs is that, well, during the process of building HEI, if competing groups don't think about safety, they're also probably not going to think about ethics too much. And so if you're in a rush to beat the Chinese or whoever to build your HEI first, then you'll spend less time on, say, the value loading problems or figuring out how to ensure that the HEIs don't get out of control and cause lots of suffering subroutines in their features and things like that. So taking things slower and allowing more parties to have a say in how HEI is developed seems important in expectation for ensuring that the worst inhumane HEI scenarios are not realized. Sometimes it's thought that if you want to reduce suffering and you don't care about other things, then you should be in favor of a paperclip maximizer that turns the universe into paperclips. But that misses the fact that the paperclip maximizer would have lots of instrumental computations that would include suffering subroutines. Potentially, it would need to learn about the world, and so it would run lots of simulations of extraterrestrials or like other kinds of animals. Potentially, lots of minds, as Mike was saying, like there might be lots of digital lab experiments without digital anesthesia, things like that. And so there are ways that a paperclip maximizer would not be humane, and because it doesn't have humane constraints on its actions, if it did run those simulations, it would have no qualms about repeating the Holocaust or whatever would be useful for its science experiments and things like that. So it could be bad in terms of multiplying suffering for AI to get out of control. At the same time, there are also ways that human-controlled AI could cause lots of suffering as well. Some of the things we mentioned, including like running simulations of wildlife or creating virtual realities where you shoot up characters in video games, and the video games are enhanced to have more lifelike conscious experiences to make them more realistic. And humans also would need suffering subroutines to do their computations, and they might also want to run simulations to study the world. And so it's not clear that like humans are obviously more humane than an HEI, especially if the human-controlled HEI is, say, military created or something, rather than the result of a more inclusive political process to decide how it's constructed. So I think there needs to be more exploration of what kinds of AIs might result from what kinds of development scenarios, and which features of those AIs we want to push for and against. So it's not an open and shut case, like in which directions someone who wants to reduce suffering should push HEI development. But on the whole, it seems plausible to me, at least as a first pass guess, that we should want it to be more safe rather than less safe in the sense of more human control, because when you have more human control, you have more possibility for preventing the worst case outcomes, and at least ideally building in humane measures, although whether humans actually take those humane measures, or whether, like in the case of factory farms today, they're mostly ignored for reasons of economic and political and profit dominance, it remains to be seen. But it's also the case that promoting a more compassionate society, and a society where people care about reducing suffering in a serious way in light of these considerations, is also very important, because that will influence the culture and context in which AI is developed. So I'll see if other people want to say something. The last thing I was going to mention, as I said before, was to talk about charities that I support. But I'll see if other people have comments.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say. So I should probably head out pretty quick as well, Adam. But yeah, I guess I could jump to closing remarks.
Sure.
Cool. So I do think Valence is tractable, is solvable, and it's just and it's actually probably it's a lot simpler than we think it is, and we just have to I don't know, not think of it as an untractable problem. What I'm looking for right now is someone with a very good abstract mathematical background, something like background in topology and group theory, perhaps, and with if they're familiar with like Tononi and Tegmark and Griffith's theories, or just Tononi's integrated information theory, that would be a plus. So yeah, look me up if that sounds like you. So yeah, other than that, I just think this is a really cool, well, I don't know if we can say cool problem, but a very interesting and important problem, and one that I think has a lot of implications for a lot of different things. So that's what I have to say.
Many thanks for joining us, Mike. David, I see you're here. Is there any other concluding remarks you'd like to add, or anything about like counterintuitive sources of suffering?
All right, I'm going to sign off. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mike. It's been awesome having you. Speak soon.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Cheers. Yeah, Brian, I guess it's just you and me.
Okay.
So, yeah. What's your concluding remarks? If you want to include the which charities you prefer to sort of give to, or how you evaluate which charities or rank them, which ones are the best for you, then yeah, let us know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's an important question in its own right, which charities and in general, which causes should be supported by people who want to reduce suffering as the top priority. So my current guesses are a few organizations that I think are all pretty worth supporting. The top is the Foundational Research Institute, which I mentioned before, is something that I helped to start in Switzerland, and it explores questions like the kinds of things that we've been talking about today, especially HAI safety is probably going to be one of our top priorities, or not just safety, but also trajectories and thinking about what kinds of HAIs would result from what kinds of dynamics and in which directions would we prefer to see the research pushed so that it is more likely to not result in lots of suffering. So along those same lines is the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which is well known among effective altruists. I think they have a pretty good grasp on these issues, and they're not as focused on reducing suffering. Like, their main goal is to promote a complex kind of, I guess they support promoting various human values, but which include what Eliezer Yudkowsky calls fun theory, or other kinds of complex values that people care about, not exclusively or even primarily reducing suffering. But they still seem to be aligned on many issues. For example, they also don't want AIs that get out of control and lead to worst case outcomes. And they seem to be very competent in studying these issues on the whole. I disagree with them on certain points. I tend to think that HAI will take off more slowly than most people at MIRI do. And there are various other specific ways in which I disagree with them. But like, in terms of understanding the importance of getting HAI right, and especially from the perspective of thinking about ethics seriously, I think they take ethics more seriously than many other projects that work on HAI. I think they're aligned enough with the cause of reducing suffering that they're probably worth supporting, and probably pretty effective. And then the other charities are arguably less important in the cosmological scheme of things, but might also be pretty important in the short term and might have far future implications. So one of them is called Animal Ethics, and that it's a general animal organization, but it has a big focus on reducing wild animal suffering, and as a first step, making sure that people care about wild animals and recognize the suffering that they endure. And that has the goal both of helping to improve the condition of wild animals in the short term, but also, and maybe more importantly, reducing the likelihood that our descendants spread wild animals into space in some of the scenarios that I mentioned before. And also, in the long run, that kind of work will also lead to more concern for digital forms of suffering that might not look exactly like animals, but might be more abstract. And then one other charity that I think is efficient at what it does, it's more of a short-term focused charity. It's called the Humane Slaughter Association, and they do research to develop methods of humane slaughter of livestock in the UK. One of their accomplishments was to develop machinery to do electrical stunning of farmed fish in the UK, and now a significant portion of farmed fish in the UK are stunned with that technology, whereas it was basically non-existent a decade ago. Unfortunately, most fish, especially wild-caught fish, have no stunning at all, and in most parts of the world, there's no stunning. So there's a lot of work to be done still, but they've helped tens of millions of fish per year, probably, with their work. And so the reason I bring them up is related to what David Pearce said about the importance of not neglecting short-term suffering. I think there's something to be said for doing some concrete short-term suffering reduction work to keep yourself grounded and avoid just floating away into fun philosophy discussions, which are certainly important in their own right, but it's good to, in my opinion, have some balance between the two to make sure you're also making some concrete difference. So that's why I support a combination of the charities that I listed. More generally, what's the best thing to do to reduce suffering apart from supporting charities? I think supporting charities is a pretty good step for a lot of people. Earning to give to good charities is competitive for many people as like the best way to use their comparative advantage to achieve good in the world. As far as if you don't donate, then doing the kinds of work that those charities do is probably a good choice, including exploring future scenarios and how to shape them in better directions with a focus on HEI, because that's probably a big leverage point, but it doesn't have to just be HEI. So I think there are a lot of big picture questions about how society will evolve in the future that it would be good to explore. What are the best leverage points? Like, should we influence politics or the economy or technology or the speed of technologies, or what values people hold? And it's not clear exactly which of those focal points has the greatest leverage, but exploring which of those places to push on and then in which directions we want to push seems important. And then also just expanding the movement of people who take these issues seriously and who want to reduce suffering in the future, and creating more minds who can think about these hard questions is also a robust strategy.
Excellent. Well, thanks heaps, Brian. And it's been great having you on the show. And along with Andreas, Mike, and David, it's been a wonderful evening for you, and I guess nighttime for David. So, yeah, I look forward to perhaps at another stage interviewing you in particular in more detail. Yes, at some other stage in the future. I've got a conference to sort of do, but in the meantime, yeah, I wish you all the best in your research and keep on going. It's wonderful. So,
and thanks for organizing.
yeah, for sticking around for such a long time. It's been a really enlightening 3 hours. So, looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Me too.
Cheers, Brian.
All right. Have a good morning.
Thank you.